Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon. I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of the rest of the staff at Town Hall, the LA Bay Book Company, and our friends at the Institute for Systems Biology, it is a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation on the Executive Dr. Temple Grandin and Dr. Jim Heath as part of Town Hall's Arno Matulski Science Lecture Series. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for joining us here on our new streaming platform, myths.org. Like everything at Town Hall, it is most certainly a work in progress, so please don't hesitate to share any thoughts you may have at the address that you'll see in the chat below the video pane. Tonight's conversation will run around an hour, including Q&A, maybe a little more. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field, so please submit yours at any time. You can also text your questions to 206-504-2857. That number is also in the chat. We cannot guarantee we'll get to every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. And toward that end, please keep your questions concise and, as we like to say, in the form of a question. For those who would like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The program will be available for rewatching later this evening. Town Hall is adding new programs every day. Upcoming events include, I should say, through the month of June, and then things will slow down a little bit. Upcoming events include Charles Wolfe in conversation with In the Moment co-host Steve Scher, discussing strategies for creating a distinctive city culture. Housing expert Dana Borland and Grift's Clayton Aldern in a conversation about the intersection of the climate crisis and the housing crisis. Pulitzer Prize winning professor Annette Gordon-Reed discussing her new book On Juneteenth. And 2 live in-person events in our Great Hall, like actual people sitting in our actual pews. These are in the month of June. The first is a cool installation under the dome, the culmination of our residency by Timothy White Eagle. And the second will feature the extraordinary range and delicate phrasing of John A. Kendrick, a terrific local singer, and an evening co-produced by our friends at Earshot Jazz. You can also view that one online if you're not quite ready to join us in the building yet. You can check out more of what's upcoming by visiting our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's, I just said that part about Town Hall's work being made possible that way. One final note before we dive in, you'll want to dive deeper into tonight's topic by purchasing a copy of Dr. Grandin's book. Please use the link in the chat to purchase through the LA Bay Book Company and not, somewhere else online that's also a vendor of groceries and electronics and whatnot. Keep it local, and maybe the things we love about Seattle from before the pandemic will still be here to delight us on the other side. With all of that, I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Jim Heath, who will be your guide for the rest of the evening, including an introduction of our guest speaker. Dr. Heath is president and professor of the Institute for Systems Biology. He also holds the position of professor of molecular and medical pharmacology at UCLA and has directed the National Cancer Institute-funded NSB Cancer Center since 2005. Formerly, he taught, I should say, at Caltech and served as co-director of the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy at UCLA until 2017. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Heath.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to, as usual, acknowledge our friends at Town Hall for helping us co-sponsor events like this. I'm Jim Heath. I'm the president and professor at ISB. We're a nonprofit research institute located in the South Lake Union area of Seattle. And we do a lot of research on cancer, COVID, brain health, aging, much more. We also have STEM educational programs. We reach out and throughout many, many schools in the Pacific Northwest, K through 12 programs. I'm particularly proud of the impact that we have on inclusion and equity and addressing historically underrepresented groups and getting them excited about science, which is one of the reasons why we're here tonight. If you want to learn more about ISB's educational work, next week we have a STEMsational free event, and you can find out about it at isbscience.org. But I want to get to tonight's show. So it's actually just an honor and a privilege to be able to introduce Dr. Temple Grandin. Temple is a New York Times bestselling author. In fact, this book here had me outdoors breaking rocks last night. It's tells you about doing science outside, and which is, I'm a scientist. I just have a natural curiosity about things, and I would recommend anybody to go get that book if they can. Of course, Temple's written many books. She's also been the subject of a award-winning Hollywood movie titled, suitably, Temple Grandin, that starred Claire Danes as playing Temple. Temple has had a huge impact in many places, in animal welfare and livestock. She's been one of the most outspoken advocates for autism. And anyway, I'm just excited about tonight. And so I'm just going to pass on the baton to Temple. When she's finished, we'll have a Q&A session, and I'll rejoin, and hopefully we'll have an exciting discussion. So.
Well, it's great to be here. I hope you can put my first slide up, and it shows a cover of the book. And we need to be getting kids outside doing things. And one of the projects is described in The Outdoor Scientist is our rock collections. And my sister and I were really big in this. I was probably 10 and she was about 8. We'd find rocks, we'd bust them in half. And I strongly recommend safety goggles for this, because it was so interesting to look at the different colors inside the rocks. And then we displayed them on 2 different shelves in the tool shed. Other projects in the book are beach. And then one of the projects in there on animal behavior, I actually did in college, but kids can do it. The assignment was we had to watch an animal for 4 hours and write down everything it did. That's called an ethogram. And we had a lot of kids in the neighborhood right here. They're never outside. There's a point where we need to get them off the devices. I talked to a mom just the other day, and her daughter went out and found out that bugs in the grass were pretty interesting. I was sitting outside in the gazebo with my students, and because we couldn't go to the university, I had to stay outside, and we'd have some lunches outside, and a squirrel was burying a nut. Very interesting to watch. He'd dig a hole, then he'd try it, and it wouldn't be deep enough. So he put the nut in his mouth, and then he'd try again. And on the 3rd try, he got the hole deep enough, and he buried the nut. So there's a lot of stuff like, right in the front yard, we got squirrels, we got bunnies. There's a lot of animals to watch. Now on my next slide, I want to ask, what would happen to some of our top innovators today? What would happen to them if they'd been born today, now, rather than, quite a few years ago? Because many of them had an unconventional educational path. Now, as you know, I have autism. When I was 4, I had no speech. I was good at art. My mother always encouraged my art ability. And there's some famous people that have autism. Let's look at one right here. He just announced it on Saturday Night Live, Elon Musk. Now you see these Post-it notes? These are a 6-year-old Post-it notes. I put those in there right after the book was published to mark the parts of the book where I thought he was autistic. No, I couldn't say it before, but now I can say it. And you can go on Saturday Night Live, comes right out and says it. Well, he's having a pretty successful life. Another thing is he's really into what he does. So let's go on to the next slide. Another observation that I have made is a lot of grandparents have come up to me at various autism and educational meetings, and they discover that they're on the autism spectrum when the kids get diagnosed. Now, autism is a continuous trait. Elon Musk probably had the no speech delay, type of autism. I had speech delay, and then autism can vary from very severe, where there's no speech and they can't dress themselves. Very big spectrum. But a little bit of autism may give some advantages. There's a super interesting paper called Genomic Trade-offs. You can look this paper up online. Genomic trade-offs are autism and schizophrenia, the steep price for a human brain. The same genes that make our brains big are the same genes that are involved with autism and schizophrenia. Lots of different genes. In autism, you may get extra circuits growing maybe in the math department or the art department. Schizophrenia, the network's kind of skimpy and falls apart later. But it's a true continuous trait. You're not going to find the autism gene. And if you totally got rid of autism, you better take really good care of the computer you've got now, because you probably won't get another one. Another fascinating paper was solitary mammals as a model for autism. And lions are much more social than panthers and leopards. Now, does that mean that panthers and leopards are defective? No, it doesn't. It's a true continuous trait. Now, the next slide shows that famous picture of looking at Earth from the moon. Probably the most important thing that NASA did on that trip. Gives you a total different way of looking at all kinds of problems we're having today. It's a finite space out there. In fact, this picture wasn't even on the original list of things for them to do. The astronauts just took this picture. And then I had a chance, and I'll show on the next slide, visiting the vehicle assembly building. I got really emotional when I went to Cape Kennedy about 3.5 years ago, because this is one of the greatest things I thought our generation did. And I get really emotional about the things that we do. You see, a brain can be more social emotional, or a brain can be more about the things that they do. And one of the things that's made my life worthwhile is I've done quite a lot of different things in my career with improving how animals are treated. I get really happy when I get an email and somebody writes to me and they say, "Oh, my kid went to college because of your book." That really pleases me. I'm going to get into talking about some of the different kinds of minds. I think completely in pictures. I've discussed that in my book, Thinking in Pictures. And if you watch the HBO movie, Temple Grandin, it shows exactly how I think. It is in pictures. And we need our visual thinkers, and we need them in various STEM programs, even though I can't do algebra, but you need us. Let me show you why. The next slide shows a launch pad that was just being finished. And I was there at 7 o'clock in the morning with a bunch of other people. And I went inside the launch pad platform, a lot of equipment in there. And when I was walking up to it like this, I saw something that absolutely shouldn't be in that launch pad. And that's why you need the visual thinkers. I saw a little motion over on the stairway that came down, and it was a raccoon. He went down the stairs, waddled off in the bushes. He definitely shouldn't be there. And I got to thinking, what have you been chewing? This doesn't sound very good. You could be chewing something really important. You see, engineers calculate risk. Visual thinkers can see it. Now, this next slide is one of my most important slides. It's the different types of thinking. And there's scientific research to show that different kinds of thinking actually really do exist. Scientifically, I am an object visualizer. Poor at algebra. Think totally in pictures. Kind of jobs that I might go into, art, graphic design. Also, object visualizers are really good with mechanical things. The second kind of thinking is a spatial visualizer in music and math. These are your mathematicians, computer programmers, good at music, good at math, good at all the things I'm terrible at. And then you have the verbal thinkers. Now, there's different ways these different thinkers approach problem solving. I've been reading some studies on this. Both the picture thinkers like me and the mathematicians, when we're going to do a project, we plan it out ahead of time. Verbal thinkers, they tend to get a big idea, very top down. We might talk about inclusive education or climate change or some other thing. But okay, how do I actually fix something? There's a tendency for verbal thinkers to overgeneralize. And for the other type of thinkers, we get into so much detail, we overload the minds of the verbal thinkers. Right now, I'm working on a book with visual thinking because I had to have a COVID project. My wonderful co-author, Betsy, she's totally verbal, thinks totally differently than I do. And we've discovered a really good way to communicate. About every week, we have a big hour-and-a-half long conversation. And then after that, I send her stuff by email and I text her, so she doesn't get inundated with too much information. But then the way she rearranges my stuff is just beautiful. Because a visual thinker like me is associational. Get lots of data, pick all the bits and pieces out of it. It's not linear. And I love the way that Betsy can rearrange my stuff. She's absolutely a magician at doing that. But I'm realizing now that trying to understand some things about the mechanical world, for example, really difficult for a verbal thinker. Unless the verbal thinker has actually experienced the thing. For example, explaining leverage, pry the lid of a paint can off the screwdriver. Let's go to the next slide. Now let's look at some mission critical expertise. We'll start with the math side of it. Katherine Johnson, she's a Black mathematician, has now gotten a credit she deserved. She calculated the orbital paths for in suborbital paths with early Mercury and projects and Gemini projects. Now, one good thing that was done with her is when she was a child, she was moved ahead into advanced math. A big problem I see with a lot of kids that are bored in school, they might be super good at math, and they make them do the baby math, and then you wonder why the kid's a behavior problem. Well, move them ahead in math and don't use this weird verbal math. Get the old-fashioned books out of the attic, the old algebra books. I'd use it for a doorstop. But I've seen other kids go find that book and they just take off with it. Then you have Hal Laning, pure mathematician at MIT, did the algebra equations that made it possible for the extremely limited memory on the lunar lander not to get overloaded. Mission critical. Both of them. Now we want to go on to where my kind of thinking was involved. The next slide shows the spacesuit. And yes, it was made by the Bra Company. And that didn't become known until a book called Spacesuit got written. Four of the finest seamstresses Playtex sewed it. And their boss was a former TV repairman, probably had no engineering degree, made the engineers crazy. But they knew how to make a garment where the astronaut could move around in it. You need all the different kinds of minds. Let's go to the next slide. Now I looked up some more recent stuff. These are the cameras for the Mars rover Perseverance. Look at the hand-done wiring on those. Somebody in a shop did that. You see, you need the visual thinker like me that might make those on a workbench. And then you need the mathematicians to get the spaceship to Mars. You see, the different kinds of minds are complementary. And if you go and you look up the Mars rover, our Mars rover, she's taken really great selfies of herself with a robot arm. And the Chinese rover is also taking pictures of herself. And when you look at these, and I've looked at them very carefully, they have lots of hand-done wiring on them. Mission critical. We need the visual thinkers, the people like me that can't do the math, to do make some of the equipment. This is a very, very high-end skilled trades. We have a tendency to poo-poo it. I worked with brilliant people that were dyslexic, autistic, ADHD, owned metal fabrication companies. They had 20 patents. Let's go to the next slide. And the company that made the camera, there's a nice picture of Mars. I love that rocks. The company that made the camera, they were all geologists. They wanted to get great pictures of rocks. I could relate to that. Wouldn't it be fun to bust a Martian rock in half? That would be. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide shows the patent, my grandfather's invention. He was a co-inventor for the autopilot for airplanes. And he worked with another person who was probably autistic, who had the idea for these three little coils, which the aviation companies thought was the stupidest thing they ever saw. And my grandfather goes, I can make this work. Meanwhile, all the airplane companies were trying to connect the magnetic compass directly to plane steering That was sort of like this. That was like kind of hopeless. And they tinkered for years in the loft over a garage where they fixed trains. They finally got it to work. It was in every plane during World War II. Except they weren't very good business people. It got ripped off. The ripoff was in the warplanes. But then after the war, Sperry gave them a decent contract, and it was in lots of other aircraft after that. But that's another example of a team. The more classical, degreed, MIT-trained engineer, and the kind of lone inventor guy who came up with this totally very simple original idea that regular corporations thought was stupid. Let's go to the next slide. Now let's look at someone like Michelangelo. Dropped out of school at age 12. Now he had a lot of autistic traits. His hygiene wasn't too great, but he was exposed to the art. Every church was commissioning art. So he'd be around the neighborhood looking at that. And he grew up in a family of stone cutters. So he got exposed to the tools and exposed to the art. I get asked all the time, how did I get involved in the cattle industry? I was exposed to it when I was a teenager on my aunt's ranch. Finding with many careers, students are get exposed. A lot of kids today aren't doing enough stuff to figure out what they might want to do. Let's go on to two other famous people. I got slides here of Einstein and Steve Jobs. Bullied in school, and Elon Musk was horribly bullied in school and pushed down the stairs. Einstein had no speech until age 3. Now, all those granddads I told you about, one of the reasons they were successful is because they had learned how to work at a young age. They had paper routes. Elon Musk was out selling stuff. He made a video game and sold it for $500. Then he tried to lease a shop so he could have a video game store, and he was too young to sign a lease. He also was exposed to a whole lot of stuff. You see, this is the other really important thing is a kid, a lot of travel. I mean, he saw a lot of stuff, and he's fulfilling his childhood dream. Just the other day, I was looking at the news. There was a picture of a big silver, gigantic rocket he's got against the sunset. I'm going, that's a childhood dream. That's what he's doing. He loves his factories. He's had a whole bunch of fancy houses, and he sold those. No, it's all about career, what you do. One thing about being an autistic person, you are at what you do. Let's go on to the next slide. And Thomas Edison was described as a hyperactive adult high school dropout. He probably had autism. Oh, and he would have, what would have happened to him today? Well, he probably would have gotten in all kinds of trouble. Now, I want to show you the next slide, all the different classes that we need to be keeping in the schools. Worst things the schools ever did is taking out art, sewing, cooking, playing musical instruments, woodworking, theater, welding, auto shop, creative writing. Because these expose you to a lot of different things you can do. Einstein played the violin, and it probably was really helpful for him formulating some of his theories. You're not going to know if you'd like acting if you don't have a school play. I wasn't interested in acting in the play, but I loved making costumes and scenery for school plays. You see, that's something that can turn into a career. And I worked with welders, building big, complicated things that were autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD. Let's go to the next slide. Now, how do you figure out what kind of a thinker a kid is? The visual thinkers like me like art. They love to build things. They like mechanical things, good at drawing. My drawing skills showed up at around age 8. I did not read until that time. Mother homeschooled me with phonics. Let's get a book worth reading. Dick and Jane books were not worth reading. See Dick run, run, run. That's not very interesting. And I learned with phonics. And there may be another kid. Okay, Jim, I see I'm making a chuckle here. I insisted at least one person be over there in the little Zoom box there, but I didn't want to talk to a town hall logo or an ISB events logo. That's just too boring. I got to have somebody to talk to. And the mathematical kids, they like computer science, music, programming, chemistry, physics. Now, how is a kid going to find out he likes computer programming if he's not exposed to it? Now, I tried, couldn't do it. I took piano lessons. That did not work very well. But at least I was exposed to it. Another kid gets exposed to computer programming, they take off with it. In fact, Bill Gates and I were exposed to the exact same computer. He took off on it. I could log into it, and that was about it. The motivation was there. Nope, visual thinkers don't do very well in programming. But where the computer industry needs the visual thinkers is on the interfaces. The reason why Zoom took over, it was easy to use. That's why Zoom took over. And verbal thinkers tend to love facts. They also tend to love broad, verbal-based principles. But then there's no details on how do you actually implement something like an inclusive classroom or some other kind of a thing. I tend to look at these things as specific examples. Okay, here's a specific example where the inclusive classroom really worked. Here's another situation where it was a disaster. And then I try to put those into categories so we can avoid the things that would make a mistake, that where the simply wouldn't work. Let's look at my education. I was in a small school with only 12 students in elementary, so the fully inclusive classroom worked for me. But if there'd been 30 kids in that classroom, I would have needed to have an aide. High school was a disaster of teasing and bullying, and the only places I was not teased and bullied was friends through shared interests. I can't emphasize that enough. Another thing I want to emphasize is learning how to work. We need to find substitutes for the paper route. Things like volunteer jobs at a community center, farmer's market, or church, helping out the neighbors with lawn and garden work. Find other things, to replace the paper route. Got to learn working skills, and working skills are different than academic skills. Let's go to the next slide. Kids need to get exposed to stuff. Here's just more. I already talked about a lot of stuff. Visual thinkers like me often are very good at training animals. Some of the verbal thinkers on the autism spectrum are very good at specialized sales. I gave a talk for a bank, and they've got 2 autistic salespeople that sell specialized financial products. I just got an email from a person that's an insurance adjuster who's on the autism spectrum. Things that involve detail, knowing facts. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, a Nobel Prize winner was 50% more likely to have an arts and crafts hobby compared to other scientists. That's why the schools need to be not taking out all of the hands-on classes. And I also have another book where I have all my childhood aviation projects, where I spent hours outside playing with little bird kites, figuring out how to make my parachute open up better, getting out and doing things. A lot of kids today are terrified of making a mistake. But I had to make a lot of different kites before I got the kite to work. I had to get out and I had to tinker with it and do things. And when I did a book signing for Calling All Minds, I found out that maybe 1/3 of the kids in Colorado in elementary school had never made a paper airplane. This is ridiculous. Let's go to the next slide. The other thing I learned is that when you are weird, you've got to learn to sell your work, not yourself. So I'm going to show you a portfolio of what I did to show my work. The next slide shows the hand-done drawing I did back in 1978 for the Dipping Bat project that was shown in the HBO movie Temple Grandin. And I'd take one of these drawings and put it out on the desk, and people were impressed. And then I'd show pictures of jobs. We can go on to the next slide. And the next slide shows the actual drawing I sent to Cargill, to sell Cargill. This was back in the late 80s. I designed the front end for every Cargill beef plant in North America. And I sent them pictures. Now, why would I write on there? You have to touch to perceive. Well, the industry went from hand drafting in the mid-90s to computer drafting. I started seeing very strange mistakes on drawings. People were not seeing their drawing. Like the center of a circle wasn't in the center of a circle. I'm talking very basic mistakes here. And I would question these people, and I'd find out that usually they'd taken a course in CAD drafting, but they had never built anything, and they had never drawn by hand. There was totally no hands-on. They simply weren't seeing what they were drawing. And even for me as a visual thinker, it took me a while to learn how to read drawings. I had to learn that a square on a floor plan might be a column that holds up the roof. And the way I learned to read drawings is I made my own self-made internship at the Swift plant in Arizona in the early 70s. And I walked around the entire plant with the blueprints until I could relate every line on that drawing with everything in that plant. And it was a beautiful, detailed set of drawings. I mean, it even had the parking lot lines drawn on it. It had everything. Let's go to the next slide. Now that's one of the pictures that got sent to Mr. Fielding. It's just showing one of my curved cattle handling systems. And we go on to the next slide. It shows my system, one of my systems they built for the HBO movie. I love the fact the movie showed my projects. The geek side of me, I really liked it. And the titles of the movie actually had some working drawings, some shop drawings that were used to build some equipment were put in the title. I thought that was very, very cool. Because I liked having the project shown. It also showed how visual thinking works. And it showed that perfectly. Let's go to the next slide. Now, I had a nice brochure. Back in the 70s, colored photos were just too expensive. I had to go with black and white brochure, but something really professional. Just showing off stuff I did, explaining what I did. 30-second wow. You know, Mr. Fielding only needed 30 seconds to look at the stuff, say, yep, you're gonna hire me to design one of the first big Cargill beef plant front ends. We'll go on to the next slide. And that's another one of the pictures he got sent. That's a job I did back in 1983, back east. And half the cattle in North America are handled in the center track restrainer system that I worked on developing. And you can see that if you want to watch beef plant video tour with Temple Grandin, you can see that piece of equipment. And then this next slide here shows a black and white aerial photo of the dip vat project. Now, as I think about this, the owner of the feed yard had an Aranca stunt plane. And he tilted it over and decided about leaning out the window when I took this picture. That was really, really cool. You see, then the way visual thinking works, then I get associations. And then I'm seeing different parts of this project when they were building. Another thing I'm seeing in my mind right now is some of my mentors that helped me get going. It started with my mother, my third grade teacher, my wonderful science teacher in high school who got me interested in studying. I wasn't motivated to study until studying became a pathway to a goal. And then another good mentor was Jim the contractor. He was starting a little tiny construction business and he saw my drawings and he seeked me out. And you know what? Jim was a former military officer. And another person that helped me was Norb, the superintendent at the Swift plant. He was another former military officer. I don't know. Jim put together a very diverse team of people in starting his company. Military sort of no nonsense, let's get projects done, you know, kind of things. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, who builds large food processing plants? I've done a lot of work for lots and lots of different companies. And what I have found when I've been out on these big construction sites is that there's kind of a division of labor by the different types of thinking. My kind of thinkers are in the drafting department. They design all the, like what I call clever engineering department, like a really, really clever packaging machine. They'll design that. The more mathematical thinkers do things like refrigeration, calculate snow load on roof, boilers, power and water requirements. And I've seen this pattern in every project I've worked on. Now, one of the problems is the visual thinkers are retiring and they're not getting replaced. And the reason for that is we took shop class out of the schools 25 years ago and we're starting to pay for it. Big, big, big problem. We're also going to need our visual thinkers to protect infrastructure against hacking. You know, we've had hacking of the Colonial Pipeline, hacking of the JBS meat plant. Now it made a mess out of all their logistics systems and, you know, billing and orders, but none of the physical infrastructure was hurt. I'm really concerned about protecting physical infrastructure from hacking. And that's got to be done with absolutely isolating a lot of this physical structure from the internet. Like, and you're going to need the visual thinker, you know, go down in the basement of one of that big meat packing plant, and I want to talk to the guy down in the shop. He'll tell me how to protect it. And the visual thinking often doesn't get enough credit. I went to a big fancy dancy tech place, and I'm not going to say what it was, I'll say it was far away from Seattle. I'll say that much, far away from Seattle. And the engineers were all housed in the tower. And my department got stuck in a basement full of cable trays in a service corridor. No, we're both members of the team and we're equally important. And that was something that really ticked me off. Now, every time I see a cable tray now, I'm mad. You know, at least in the meat industry, we're democratic. Everybody who works in construction, degreed engineers, the maintenance person, the welders, we all have horrible offices. We're democratic. No, but I'm very concerned about the visual thinkers are, you know, getting addicted to video games, not going anywhere. There's been 3 successes with young autistic adults addicted to video games, weaning them off into car mechanics. And he discovered that car mechanics is more interesting than video games. Let's go on to the next slide. I'm going to estimate that 20% of the people I worked with were either autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD. 2 of them own large metal fabrication companies, multiple patents, designing and building complex things. The next slide, I want to talk about skills that we're losing. That's a big pork processing plant. Took that picture in 2019. Everything on that floor is imported from the high wage countries. A lot of it is from Holland. Now that's the price we're paying for taking out shop glass. I just went to another pork plant, you know, just after I got vaccinated, and the equipment very similar room like this, Holland, Denmark, and Italy. Very nice equipment, beautiful equipment. But we ought to be making some of this stuff. We still have some pockets where we're making the stuff. I went to a chicken processing plant, and it's right smack dab in the middle of farmland. So there's a family that came off the farm. It's a mom and their son, and they make custom equipment. They had the nicest little small packaging machine for meat that they had made in the shop. They didn't want that big, huge, long thing. They wanted something a lot smaller. But that's just a pocket of activity where you've got kids working on the farm. You go in other parts of the country, no, they're importing everything. We're losing skills. I'm very concerned about this. Visual thinkers get screened out of STEM programs because we can't do the math. But you need us. You need us, and you need us really, really, really badly to prevent mistakes like Fukushima. I was shocked when I found out why Fukushima burned up. They had no watertight doors. They'd had watertight doors, they wouldn't have flooded. Emergency cooling pump with an electric motor doesn't run underwater real well. You see, I see that. Yeah, you need us, and you need us really bad. Let's go on to another slide. That's the Steve Jobs Theater. That roof is a carbon fiber. It came from the Middle East. The glass structural walls there, the wiring is in the seams between the glass. No columns. That glass is from Germany and Italy. I actually tracked down the companies that built this stuff. Now, what we got to do, one of the reasons why Europe and Italy are still doing this stuff is they haven't taken out skilled trades. They're not sticking their nose up at it the same way some people here are. No, in this year, I'm talking real high-end stuff. I'm not talking roofing here or laying asphalt or concrete flat work. I'm not talking about that stuff. Talk about the real high-end stuff. And I had a mom come to me, and she was very upset. Her kid was really mechanically clever, but he was flunking algebra, and he couldn't graduate from high school. And she asked me what he should do. And there's a big back door. I watched people come into the meat industry, get a job on a line, then gravitate to maintenance. 15 years later, they get to play with giant Legos, building a new plant addition. I have seen that. And I told him there was an Amazon warehouse about 2 miles from the house. And he was old enough. I said, get a job there. Let me tell you how this works. You do every job on that floor. And your goal is you're going to design the next one. I have seen that pathway. That is doable. Now, you can't just go in there and be a big know-it-all. You got to pay your dues, learn every job on the floor. But I have seen a lot of people go in that back door and end up, designing big, important projects. Let's go on to the next slide. That's what I would do. Let's say somebody waved a magic wand and I still had the knowledge that I had, but I was 18 years old and I couldn't graduate from high school because I flunked algebra. And I never have passed an algebra class. I got out of it because in 67, it wasn't required. I took statistics and probability. But if I was in that boat now, knowing what I know now, I'd pick out something like the Amazon warehouse or some other cool thing. Let's say I'm dirt poor, because I know I could ride on one of his rockets. There's somebody who actually did that. Now as a rocket designer. Started to have lunch with the rocket designers. The back door, it's right there. People don't see it. Now this shows the parachute for Perseverance landing on Mars. I found the vendors for the fabric. It was made in the UK, probably on high-tech looms from Europe. I looked at, got it at the website of the company that did it, and a lot of European looms in there. And of course, I found the names on the looms and I looked them up. It was sewn here in the United States. See, that's another example of a high-tech thing. We've got a chip shortage right now. The single plant burned up. That really messed up the chip industry. Yeah, we're getting, these concentrated supply chains. Problem with them is when they break, they're really bad. Now, the next slide, just kind of getting close to wrapping up. Then we'll have lots of time for questions. Visual thinkers, artificial intelligence, and people with autism and ADHD are bottom-up thinkers. Verbal thinkers, big, vague verbal concepts. But you're going to need the other kind of minds, my kind of mind and the mathematical minds, to figure out how we actually are going to implement these things. See, for me, concepts are formed with specific examples. I'll see someone telling me, well, what can I do for social justice? I go, wait a minute, let's take a more well-defined thing. I've worked on improving cattle handling. That's something that's much more defined. I worked on improving slaughterhouses. That's not the whole world. Pick out some specific thing where you can actually accomplish something. Top-down thinkers, they tend to overgeneralize. And let's go on to the next slide. Now, what are some tips for companies in working with people that are different? Do not overload their working memory. I'll tell you some jobs I would not do well on. Super crazy busy takeout window. Super busy waitress, and I'm expected to remember 8 orders and all their sides, and now I'm expected to balance like 3 plates on my arm. Forget it, I'm going to break all the plates. That's not the job for me. Any task that involves sequence, give me a checklist. I don't remember verbal sequence well at all. But then with the kids, we've got to stretch them just a little bit out of their comfort zone. Limit the screen time. Get them out doing things. Now, I noticed there was a question in the chat. A mom of an autistic 3-year-old was talking about 4-H. Yes, when he's a little older, let's go in 4-H. I think 6 is about as young as you can go in 4-H. But kids need to be getting out and doing those things. Schools need to be keeping their FFA programs. I was in 4-H in high school, horses, and that was the only place I was not bullied and teased. So I want to finish up with a final slide. What is the ultimate goal of education? Where is a student 10 years after high school graduation? I was working on those DipVat projects, so I was doing 10 years after graduation. But I'm seeing too many people, they get a label, and they're sort of becoming the label. A lot of people in Silicon Valley know they're on the autism spectrum. I have been to the tech companies, and I'm really glad that Elon Musk finally came out and announced on the Saturday Night Live. I've known it for the last 16 years with Post-it notes, but now I can say it. Now I can say it. And autism is a very broad field. There are many individuals that are nonverbal. They have epilepsy. They're not working for a tech company. But we have to be looking more at what a person can do. And one of those nonverbal people, doctor rescued him from an institution, and now he has meaning in life. He made very good coffee at the local gas station, and everybody appreciated the good coffee he made. You see, that gave some purpose to his life. Now, I'm happy to do questions.
I had to go off mute. Thank you, Temple. That was fantastic. So I'm going to start off with 2 questions before I go to the chat box. I'm an experimentalist scientist, which I think you are too.
Yes.
Because you make things. So when you were making these wonderful vat dipping or the or the cattle, the circular cattle trails for the houses. And I know you made those by sort of visualizing in pictures what you thought the cattle would do in the right situation. What did you learn? What did they do that you didn't expect?
Well, one of the things I did when I was designing these things is I went around to every feed yard in Arizona and actually handled cattle. So I was looking at what things worked, what things did not work. Some curve systems already existed, but they'd have one good bit and then another bit of the system didn't work at all. They kind of took all the good bits and I put them together. The other thing on doing research is lots of times, like in the middle of a project, you discover a new something different. You need to change it. Now, I've reviewed some journal articles and I go right straight to the method section, because a lot of the problems with not being able to reproduce biomedical results get down to methods. I read about the famous example of the different ways that cancer cells were stirred, vigorous stirring versus gentle rocking. Totally messed up the results of the experiment. And I'll be reviewing a journal article and I go, you didn't tell me what breed of cattle you used. You didn't tell me how you housed them. You didn't tell me what you fed them. I'm talking basics. And I've reviewed some behavior stuff, some pretty fancy biomedical stuff, and behavior stuff with mice. And they talk about standard commercial maternity cage. Well, what is that? This is an international publication. What was the brand name of the cage? What did you bed it with? This stuff can totally change the result of a maternal behavior experiment. Methods. And what I'm finding in looking at journal articles is everybody's going crazy on the fanciest, latest statistics. But I'm seeing very basic omissions in methods. You see, when I read the methods section of a paper, I see how they would do the experiment. And they're leaving out, and they're still leaving out very basic stuff that can totally change the results of experiments. That's where you need a visual thinker. Look at the methods.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I want to elaborate on the point you made and maybe explore it a little bit. So, and there's a book, you probably have read this book. If you didn't, I'll send it to you. It's called End of Average. It's a fantastic book. And it talks about the fact that we have a lot of systems that really want to, like, standardize testing. They want to find the average and make someone test if you're above average or below average. And then we have a school system that is increasingly teaching the standardized testing, and it's leaving out a lot of the aspects of education that you've really been advocating for as being absolutely essential. Everybody's different. Everybody learns differently. And do you know of examples where you think modern examples that work well for educating the diverse spectrum
well,
of
visual
kids?
thinkers in particular are getting screened out with the really draconian algebra requirements. I have never passed an algebra class. Algebra didn't make any sense to me. And I could do my old-fashioned elementary school arithmetic the way it used to be taught in the 50s, not the weird way they do it now. I looked up some of that stuff and I'm going, oh man, that's first grade arithmetic. That's kidding. You know, but the way it used to be taught, find the area of a circle, find the volume of a tank, tank, that kind of stuff. I learned that just fine because I could always relate that back to something real. And a lot of the people I worked with couldn't do higher math. But I noticed the raccoon in the launch pad. The others didn't.
Okay,
and I just saw a little movement on the stairway and I looked and I saw what it was. Nobody else saw it. Nobody else knew a raccoon was living in that launch pad.
So how do you, when you have parents come to you and they're, struggling with an autistic kid and they're wondering how to, get that spark of interest?
Well, the first thing is you got to expose them enough stuff to get interest. Okay, the cattle interest happened because I went to a ranch. If you got to expose kids to stuff, they only get exposed to video games. It's the only thing they get interested in. And I'm seeing a lot of problems with addiction to video games, and they're going absolutely nowhere. Give them choices of different things to try. I tried the musical instruments. That didn't work for me, but I was exposed. I had a little flute. I never could figure out how to play it, but somebody else give them that flute and they'll be, composing tunes on it. But you don't know. until you expose them to stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Okay,
See,
here's a
that's
question.
the thing. It's the reason why I did these books. And a lot of the projects, in there, fairly elementary, but you look at the majority of kids around here, they're never outside.
Oh, I think
My neighborhood here, the kids in a little preschool next door are outside, but there's kids living in these other apartment buildings. And one time I go by at 3:30 in the afternoon and I see all the kids loading on a school bus. I didn't even know they were there until I saw them load on the school bus. There's a nice playground over there. I never see them out there. There's a garden out there. I see a grown-up out there once in a while out there, but never a kid.
Well, I'm going to make a plug for your book again because, I've taught students. Now they're more advanced students, but I've taught students for many years, and the one gift that a student can bring to the lab, in addition to various skill sets, is just curiosity.
That's right. And on the different kinds of brains, this is my book, The Autistic Brain, and I describe the science about the object visualizer and the more visual spatial mathematician. And there's a lot of new research that totally supports that. This came out a number of years ago, but all the new research, and I have found tons of it, it just backs up what's said in that book. And the thing is, the object visualizer, like me, a real extreme one, and an extreme mathematical person, you won't find in the same person. And then you got a lot of people that are kind of mixtures in the middle. But object visualization and the more mathematical mind are actually opposite traits. You won't find extremes of that in the same person.
That makes a lot of sense based on my experience. I hadn't thought of that before. Okay, here's a question that is a 10-year-old student sent in you a question. And the student is wondering, what was your favorite place you traveled to and why was it your favorite?
Well, I remember some trips to Australia. That's a fun place to go. Just a few years ago, I went on a small plane out in the Australian outback. That's as big as the U.S. and there's almost nothing in there. And it makes you really think about, I've been doing a lot of thinking about the use of grazing animals for food. Only way you can raise food on the Australian outback is grazing animals. There's no way to crop it. There's not enough water. And if you use the grazing animal right, they improve land. And we need to be, like even in the Midwestern United States, growing cover crop. And the only way to make money on a cover crop is you have to graze it. And if you have a cover crop rotating with soy and corn, that's going to improve the land. Bison created the best cropland in the world. Animals are part of the land. We need to start using them right to improve the land. Use them wrong, they wreck land. We could also use grazing animals for fire suppression too, as part of that.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. Here's a question. It's something I've been wondering about as well, and we've been struggling with this in our STEM programs here. So the past year, you talk about getting kids away from video games and interested in the outside world. The past year has not been good for that. Kids have been, locked onto screens for their school.
Well, and there's been some problems. But one mom told me that her daughter went out and just looked at bugs in the grass. And I was looking, it was during lockdown that I watched that squirrel. That right in my own front yard, there was stuff to watch. Things with insects, bunnies and squirrels. And it was really interesting watching how the squirrel would dig the hole, he'd test the depth, then he'd put the nut in his mouth so nobody would steal it from him, dig some more, then test the hole again. When he finally got the hole deep enough, he covered it up and left. And I sat 10 feet away and watched the whole thing. That was 15 feet from my front door during lockdown.
So you don't have to go far to get your adventures.
Well, and that's just the thing. And then I had some reporters saying, what about kids in the city? Well, pigeons are interesting. There's a lot of wildlife in the city you can look at. There's a lot of things that you can do. One of the things that helped me during the lockdown was every morning, get up, get dressed and showered, ready for work by 7 o'clock every single day. Showered, dressed for work every single day by 7 o'clock. No slouching around in jammies. And I think they can take a little hint from NASA. I actually looked up some space station schedules. Get them up, do your work, a midday meal, everybody gets together, and then they celebrate the holidays for all the nationalities. They'll bring little holiday things up on a supply ship, and then they have time for fun. I was reading this book about astronauts, and they somehow got a satellite phone hooked up, and they like to call their friends stuck in Houston traffic and get them giggling about just the silliest things, because they got to have some time for fun.
So here's a really great question. So, you've clearly had an amazing impact on the livestock industry, but have you thought about designing structures for people? Here's someone who's asking about how to make airports more calming.
Well, one of the things that makes airports not calming is when you have a storm, it messes everything up. They're definitely not calming then. In some airports are designed better than others. One of the problems you've got with airports is a lot of them hodgepodges, where it started out little. So, and it's not the same thing with cattle handling facilities. You get some old place, the hodgepodge, been added on to. O'Hara would be an example of that. Phoenix Airport would be another hodgepodge. And then you have the ones designed from scratch, Denver and Atlanta. Yeah, they're laid out a whole lot better because they were built from scratch and they were built big enough. So, when you see a lot of times when people design stuff too, and they put on an addition, they'll burn the bridge for a future expansion. I worked with one meat plant, and I told them not to put their new employee locker room in the location they put it because they would block plant expansion. 5 years later, they tore down that locker room. I told them not to do that.
Here's an interesting, question. So right now, we're about to have a really big budget, and a federal budget. And a lot of that budget's going to go toward infrastructure, and a lot of it's going to go to human infrastructure, meaning, teach our kids better. And if you could do, one or two things in public school systems, what suggestions would you make?
Well, I can tell you what I'd make. I gave you that list of all the classes scum schools have taken out, put them all back in. If I could do one thing, that would be it. Well, I'm a big Star Trek fan. I like Patrick Stewart, Captain Picard. Well, I read in some magazine that he was in the school play in 6th grade, and he decided he wanted to be an actor. Okay, that's an example of exposure to a career. And then you get to do more things. Right now, I think education is pretty well taken over by the verbal thinkers.
Yeah, I think that's right. And mathematical thinkers too.
Well, and mathematical thinkers. And us visual thinkers are really getting screened out, and you need us. And this is why I'm documenting all this stuff about the equipment. And it kind of like came to me when in 2019, I went to 2 really big pork processing plants. And I went through there, and I'm looking at nameplates on equipment, and I go, wait a minute, this is getting bad. Beef, we still have it. And beef is where I've done most of my work. But that picture I took there in 2019, and there's another one just like it. She's got a sister just like it. And I'm looking at equipment plates, and I'm going, this is bad. We really are losing it. Then I started looking up other stuff. You need the visual thinkers. They're part of the team. The engineers don't like to admit a broad company made the spacesuit, but they did. Obviously, Playtex didn't make the helmet, but they made all the soft parts of the suit. They won the bid. One other person I reading, the helmet fell off during a test.
So when you've got
the first step, I get asked, the first thing that people have to realize is you have to realize that different thinking exists. I'm learning now more and more how verbal thinking is really different from me. I find when I talk about projects that I think I communicate better with the math thinker, even though I can't do the math, than I do with some of the hyper-verbal thinkers, especially if we're discussing equipment, anything that's mechanical or technical.
I mean, it occurs to me that we don't, I think it's obvious that we don't actually test for that kind of a skill. And yet I agree with you. We need verbal thinkers. And I mean, we need not verbal thinkers. We need pictorial thinkers. We need people that see in pictures. We need verbal thinkers. We need mathematical thinkers. I mean, I think everybody's
Well,
got
I didn't realize how the skills we were losing, that there's a lot of stuff we just are not making anymore. And it goes back to taking out those classes.
So basically
and
bringing
somehow,
vocation.
you know, and the other thing is, okay, the degreed engineer's got a college education, but I've worked with people that are really autistic. 20 patents, 30 patents. I can't tell you the names, they're not diagnosed. Own a big company, sell stuff all over the world. I've been in their shops, I've worked with them. And they're not getting replaced. And I'm talking about complicated stuff here.
So something you showed in one of your talks that I saw online was, I think it was a brain scan of your own brain.
Yep.
Showing that you had a significantly more robust, was it probably optical visual cortex?
Oh yeah, a huge circuit goes from the frontal cortex all the way back to primary visual cortex. It's double the size. Huge circuit. And that is published in the autistic brain. And then I speak what you hear. I've got little tiny nothing. I learn by what I read. And when I've been looking at some of the studies, so I'm working in this new book. I like to look at graphs and tables and things like that of data rather than reading it on results.
So I would imagine that if you looked at 100 people, you would find an entire spectrum of that particular physiology, right?
Oh, sure you would. And the thing is, I'm on the extreme end. And then I've talked to a lot of people that are kind of mixtures in the middle. But the ones that really excel at math, often they have trouble with reading. They also tend to be really good at music. And I've read some really interesting stuff about Einstein's violin. And when he was trying to solve some difficult math thing, he'd go play the violin for an hour and a half, and it would come to him.
Yeah, there's a lot of musicians in science. I think that's
as music and math go together. And I wasn't good at music, but when I first started working with cattle, it was obvious to me to look at what are those animals looking at. Well, they stopped because somebody hung a jacket on the fence, or there's a chain hanging down. And other people just weren't seeing that. Now, at the time when I first started that in my 20s, I thought everybody was a visual thinker. I didn't know I thought differently. You know, and then it's the old thing, the suits and the techies hate each other's guts. Techies hate suits. And I think some of this gets down to the different ways that people think. You see, we need the suits for the organization. I can tell you one thing, verbal thinkers should not be in charge of decisions about construction. I have seen a major disaster. Salesman, big yacker, super social. He tried to build a meat plant in 3 months. It should have taken a year to build. And he built it without enough wastewater treatment. We told him he didn't have enough wastewater treatment, and the city shut it down. Multi-million-dollar mistake back in the early 90s. Don't let a highly verbal salesman make decisions about construction. You will have a mess.
When you, if you showed me the drawings that you did, the ones that you showed in your draftings of the structures you made for cattle flow and et cetera. And you told me that you were not good at algebra. Those two seem to be almost incompatible. And so how did you visualize those structures? Did you just know the angles and the dimensions?
Well, I just sort of intuited the angles, but I also spent a lot of time on, I would go out to feed yards that had some existing facilities, and I'd measure them, and then I'd draw them. I had to learn how to relate lines on the drawing to the real thing. And that started with the Swift plant. Beautiful, big hand-drawn drawing. Everything was on that drawing. All the equipment, the livestock scale. Of course, the water tower was easy. That was just a big circle. And I walked around that plant until I see how they showed where a window was in a wall, a door is shown, different equipment was shown. And then once I learned how to do this, and then I went around and worked cattle in all these facilities, then when I draw it, I see the thing in my mind. I build it in my mind. You see, some of the earlier things I built, I did a lot of carpentry work. You might have heard about the squeezing machine. Well, I built that myself. And what I had to learn how to do is to take the shop out of the shop and do it in my head. But I had done plenty of woodworking in a real shop.
Wow, that's really
plenty,
interesting.
plenty of it.
Okay, here's a question from someone who has an autistic son. So the question is, we've used the growth mindset with our autistic son. I don't know if you are familiar with what that term is. Praising effort more than achievement. Are there other rewards that can help improve self-confidence and motivation?
Well, one of the things I think is a problem with so many kids today are afraid of mistakes is they don't do hands-on things. I'll never forget the sewing project I wrecked because I cut the fabric too quickly and there was no way to buy more fabric. I had to throw the whole thing away. You learn from the mistakes. And I think one of the things that helps self-confidence is being successful in some projects. When I finally got my little bird kite to fly. And that's in Calling All Minds. Now, the really weird textured art paper they had in the 50s, you can't buy it easily, like from a regular store. So I had to substitute file folder. It does not have the same flight characteristics. You are going to have to experiment with putting different kinds of tape on it to roughen the surface to get it to work. And I tinkered and I tinkered and tinkered. Kids are not doing that sort of stuff today. And I think some of the problems with being petrified of making a mistake goes back to not doing real things. In Calling All Minds, I have a simple little cutout of snowflake project. I had a teacher ask me in all seriousness, what would happen to a kid's self-esteem if you cut a paper snowflake and it fell apart? And I went, it's a piece of printer paper. Get another piece and try again, just printer paper. And then you might look it up on YouTube. And when I was in high school and I did that optical illusion room, my science teacher made me figure it out myself. He gave me one hint. He held up a textbook for like 5 seconds, let me look at it, a picture. But he wanted me to figure it out for myself.
Yeah, so
I think some of the problems now is self-confidence, get back to not doing enough real stuff.
Well, I think an issue is that I don't mind having students make mistakes as long as you learn from them.
But you need to learn from it.
That's right.
Cut the fabric out more carefully. That's what you learn from it.
In fact, I used to have, students at one time would come in and maybe they weren't so good at lab notebooks, and I would tell them, you need to put your drawings, your data, whatever, so that when you look back 6 months later and everything's not worked, you actually have lessons on why it didn't work and how you can make progress. You've learned something from that.
Then you learn something. And
I think that persistence is a really big deal. And I think you got to get that through training.
I think this, one thing they always said, when I was even a real little kid and I was learning how to talk, they always asked me to, do my very, very best. So there was a lot of emphasis put on effort, but they also wanted me to, progress on things. My third grade teacher was very concerned about my ability to not read. And Mother, first of all, got a book worth reading, something like The Wizard of Oz. And then she just put the alphabet up on the wall and she had me memorize the sounds. A has 2 sounds, A and A, ba, ka, da, E and sounds. And then she'd read a page and then she'd stop in the exciting part and have me read like 3 words, just sound them out. It wasn't that hard. It was like an hour a day, 4 days a week, 1 semester. And I went from no reading to 6th grade level very quickly. So some kids are fast learners, other kids are whole word learners.
I think an important thing here is that the way you learn things was so non-traditional, and yet it got you from point A to point B in a way that, it worked well, but it was non-traditional because you needed to learn non-traditionally. And I can think of many things where I needed to learn non-traditionally as well. And I think I think there's an exploration in terms of how kids learn, how adults learn, that maybe it's not such a well-defined science yet.
Okay, here's an interesting question. He's saying, I'm a math person who designs projects in my head. I can see the parts and how they fit together. Where do I fall? The first thing I want to ask is I want to find out what he was designing, because there's different kinds of design. You know, some things are more abstract. I've noticed that mathematicians and art tend to do more abstract sorts of things and less photorealistic kind of art. What the kind of thinker I am, they do what I call the clever engineering department. Like you look inside the copier, all the little wheels and stuff, kind of that sort of stuff. And yeah, I had a copier I had to throw out because one stupid little roller was broken. There was no way to replace it. That's still, that ticks me off. But there's like a lot of the packaging equipment and a lot of the equipment they have in a food processing plant is extremely clever how it's made. And lots of the people that I've worked on that stuff and have tons of patents. I remember someone telling me that their father made candy canes, and he invented some of the equipment for making candy canes, and just twist the sugar just right. You know,
but the person who wrote in the algebra question could maybe put in a comment on a project you're designing in your head. I think that's an interesting question as well.
Well, things like, okay, I designed hydraulic and pneumatic equipment with cylinders, and I would purposely size cylinders so even if you had full house air on it, you wouldn't crush the cap with it. And so I know how to find the area of a circle and calculate the amount of, force I'm going to get on that piston. I know how to do that. But that's, and I could learn how to, if there was an algebraic equation that was for some very specific use, I can learn that cookbook. But just manipulating it in my head for manipulating it, it's got to get related back to something real.
Right. And
so I can find
when you drew your ideas out, was that the kind of thing of making it real? Was that a big step towards that? Or
well, you see, in the elementary school, I mean, the way they taught math in the 50s was just totally different. You know, you learned your times tables. There was a lot of practical stuff like buying stuff in the store, and now it seems like they're trying to make verbal algebra. And I'm going, well, how do I figure out what I can spend with my allowance? One of the big problems I'm seeing with kids that have a label, not learning life skills. When I was a little kid, I had 50 cents a week for allowance. That taught me the meaning of money. I could buy five comics or 10 candy bars. But if I wanted a 69-cent airplane, I had to save. You see, the money is not abstract when I think about what I can buy with it. You see, now I see a picture of the candy bars, the comics, Superman comics, and then the airplane. If I wanted that one with a propeller, I had to save for 2 weeks. I was learning that at 7. See, kids aren't learning these basic things. And working skills, things like those granddads, they all had paper routes. They learned how to do a task on a schedule outside the home. Or they had a lawn mowing business or some other thing.
Well, let's come back.
There are some people that are kind of mixtures of the different kinds of minds. Also, another thing I found in questioning people is I worked with one really brilliant drafting person. He could lay out an entire factory and he could see all the equipment, but he was not able to make the equipment move. I can make the equipment move for like a 5-second thing.
Whoa. Okay, let's finish up with we're going on an hour and a quarter now, and I think that's probably a little bit over the time limit. But there's one last question I want to hear your thoughts on, and it's from a teacher who this person teaches students that are on the whole spectrum, and many of them don't express curiosity or comment on things that they're curious about. And so, do you have any tips on accessing curiosity?
Well, I got, autistic kids tend to get hung up on their favorite things. First of all, you got to get them off the video games. That needs to be limited. They are more addictive to kids with autism than regular kids. And give them choices of things to try and do. Always give choices. Mother always gave me choices. And then I get out and I try something new. And then I got really interested in it. or I found out I hated it. You know, get them trying different things. Then they find out they might be interested in that thing. I think a lot of times kids just don't try enough stuff. But always give the choice. You can try this or you can try that.
So give them choices, but doing nothing is not a choice.
And staying in the room all day is not a choice.
Right.
That was one thing. I was not allowed to become a recluse in my room. Even though I didn't study, I had to attend class. I had to attend all the meetings. I had to attend the chapel. They also put me to work running their horse farm. And so I went to a very expensive boarding school of horse farm management. And I got through my adolescence and I learned how to work. And I've got a paper online called How Horses Help the Teenager with Autism Make Friends and Learn How to Work. Because I also made friends through horse activities, also through model rockets and electronics activities.
Well, thank you.
They had a ballet class that I hated, but I made scenery for their show.
A ballet class.
I did that all through college, through high school, and through elementary school. I made scenery and costumes. Wasn't interested in performing.
So any last thoughts you want to leave people with, or?
Well, I think people ask me, you know, what do we do to understand this? The first thing is you have to realize the different ways of thinking exist. And then that's the first step in learning how to communicate. But I just had a situation on a recent video call where I talked about the different kinds of minds. And then I had somebody ask me, well, how do you deal with cognitive differences? I guess I thought I'd already talked about it. I just didn't use the word cognitive differences. Must have been some ultra-verbal thinker, because it was in the questions on pretty much these same slides, but I kind of changed the emphasis depending on who I'm talking to. But I think education's gotten really heavily verbal thinking. You know, when I look at some of the stuff they're doing with math, I'm going, oh man, you got to be kidding. How about, you know, learning how to budget? Because having the allowance, you know, you have all these kids that run up credit card debt. I'd never do that. It was pounded into me, you save.
So the party message, though, I think is, and I think this is an important one, is just be aware that there are different kinds of thinkers.
There are different kinds of thinkers, and they're good at different things. The other thing is they have complementary skills. Let's go back to building a food processing plant. You got the clever engineering department, and then you've got the other more mathematical people. And even look at the Mars rover. It's got a lot of beautiful hand-done wiring on her. Yeah, that needs to get a lot more credit than it gets. Don't stick us in a basement with the cable trays. I won't say the place that had that, but there's a certain kind of cable tray that when I see it, I get really mad, because the degreed engineers get in the nice offices in the tower, and we're in the dumpy basement. And the stuff, it's all important. And I'm talking high-end skilled trade stuff. I'm not talking about the roof in the house. That's just real hard work.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It was great to be here. And I hope I got everybody out there to kind of think about things differently. And the world needs all the different kinds of minds, and the skills are complementary. Let's look at Zoom. Mathematicians programming it, but a visual thinker made it work. Let's look at your iPhone. Steve Jobs was an artist. He was an artist. Mathematical engineers had to make it work when you swipe this thing like that. That's an example of the different minds working together. They have complementary skills. That's the thing. And I'm working with Betsy, a very, very much verbal thinker. And I'm kind of disorganized and associational man. She organizes my stuff so beautiful. I don't know how she does it. But I find that some scientific concepts are very hard to explain to her. But we're working together. We got complementary skills. And I think it's going to make a really great book. And we're also learning exactly how we think really differently and how to communicate. I have to be careful not to inundate her with too much information. So we're doing this texting thing. We do like a big, huge phone call, and then we do texting, which controls how much stuff I can send to her. So I got some really important stuff. No, and then when we did the book originally, I did all the rough drafts. I wrote all the initial drafts for everything myself, wrote them all by myself. But then we've got to get them more organized. But I'm learning more about how the verbal thinker is more different. I communicate easier with the mathematicians. I can't do the math, but just talking about working on a project, a lot of our planning, the way we plan it and stuff is similar. And we both get turned on by doing things, actually geeking out on our projects.
Well, Temple, I want to thank you. It's been a real honor and a privilege to have a chance to talk to you. And I want to thank Town Hall for hosting this event. I think we probably had 400 people on this Zoom call, which I think is a big deal. It means that, we had a lot of people impacted by the words you said.
Well, promoting books. Okay, if you have an autistic kid, this is my most basic book on autism, the way I see it. Lots of little short chapters. You can just sort of pick and choose. I discuss a lot of sensory issues with autism. I didn't discuss much today, and ways to deal with that. And sensory problems are real, and they can be a problem at work.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I think I'll sign off now. And thank you for having me.
Have a good evening, Temple.
I will. All righty. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.